All right, so part one of this video, and we're talking about the regulatory environment, regulatory climate for conservation easements, and the legislative kind of updates of what's going on as far as conservation legislation. I'm going to shift a bit here to part two and sort of answer that question, so what? So we have all this information, we kind of know what's going on, we can make some very logical assumptions, so what? What do we do with that information? And what would I be looking to do if I was to do something this year? What would I really be looking for? What do I just want to be careful about? And kind of sum up a little bit, kind of a reminder as to these are the things that I really think are the very key areas in any high quality project that ends up being a conservation type donation. So I'm going to go over those two things in this part two video. First, remember that this legislation, all the stuff that we talked about in part one, does not affect fee simple donations. Fee simple donations, remember, it is an analogy is just you're handing the keys and walking away. Okay, you're not retaining ownership of it. You're not having a complicated valuation calculation where you're trying to carve out, the value of just the dirt. Between the value of the dirt and what the highest and best use is. It is just, here are the keys, thank you very much, and you walk away. You're still going to get the same valuation because you're still going to get to use highest and best use, but you're not going to have any of the complications that maybe a conservation project would bring. It's just very simple and very straightforward. Downside again, these simple donations, you can only deduct up to 30% of your income. Conservation's 50. So if this legislation kills conservation going forward, effectively what they're doing is limiting your donation to 30% instead of 50%, right? They could do the same thing by just changing the 50% to 30% on conservation, but that's not really my area to understand why they would do it this way. Anyway, if conservation does get killed going forward, I think you're going to see the entire industry shift to fee simple. Saving this land, conserving this land, however you want to use the vernacular on this, it's not going anywhere. There's still a huge effort for being green and helping the environment. I think it's a good thing anyway. I think it's always good to help our environment, politics aside. And Biden still has that 30 for 30 plan where he wants to have 30% of our land protected by 2030. I think a lot of politicians support it. I don't really think it's a partisan issue. I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for it. You're going to see a lot of fee simple donations. And really, all that really means is just kind of simpler valuations and just 30% of income, right? So to give you an example, if, for round numbers, if someone would have $1 million in income, first of all, God bless you, you're a lucky person. Second of all, you can only get a donation write-off for $300,000 in a fee simple type project. Whereas in a conservation project, you can get a $500,000 write-off, right? So it changes the dynamic of that, and yeah, you are going to end up paying more tax because of it, but it's not going to totally go away, and we can still get 30% of our income deducted if we're participating in these projects. So that's the key thing to remember. So let's say December 1st, right? Again, I think that date's becoming more unlikely, but who knows? It might end up pushing this thing through quickly, and it might be right after the midterms. Before they have a changeover in office. What I'm going to be doing personally is, if December 1st, they're not going to be doing it going forward, no conservation going forward, I'm going to be seriously looking at what do I think my income's going to be for the next, let's say, 5 years, and how much conservation value do I think I might be able to use, right? So sometimes when you look at like your charitable contributions, there are times where it makes sense to make more in one year versus the other because you can take more of a deduction in 1 year versus the other. That's what I'm talking about here is, if I think I can use, let's say round numbers, $100,000 of tax write-off, and I can use that over the next 5 years, $20,000 a year, or however else that plays out. I can get $100,000 this year and just carry it forward over 5 years. You can carry it forward up to 15 years. Personally, I'm not going to go that far out. I just think looking beyond 5 years is a little too much, but that's my personal opinion. I mean, if you've got money to burn, or if you really are just overly passionate about conservation, more than fine to go for the 10, 15 years, not a problem. You just don't want to be stuck at year 15 with write-off that you can't use. Rare occasions could happen. I'm going to be looking at probably 5 years as to, I'm going to participate in something right before the date to make sure that it's all, before the legislation comes into play, that everything is on the up and up and above board, get my 5 years deduction and just have it roll forward. If I don't happen to have as much income as I might think, I still have 10 years after the 5 years to write it off. So I'll have a nice write-off for a longer period of time. Okay, again, in part one we talked about how it's very much like prohibition, where prohibition back in, how was it, 1917 or something? I can't quite remember. 1919 maybe? Anyway, it was before the Roaring Twenties, we know that, because that's what bootlegging came in. They had a date where it was no longer legal to distribute alcohol, but before that people were loading up. I mean, they sold out all the liquor stores. People were buying 10, 20, 30 bottles of gin at a time so they could have it at home. And then, that was it. They had their 30 bottles and they could drink all that, but they couldn't go buy anymore, right? That's kind of the same concept as to what this is that you're going to have one more chance, one more last hurrah. You can get your charitable conservation donations and carry it forward to 15 years, but then that's it, right? So you want to consider, how much do I want to get now, knowing how tax advantaged this thing is, I can carry it forward. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. I think that, with that type of strategy, though, as well, if you're looking at a donation value that's so high that you're going to be using it for several years, that means that instead of looking at things 3 times, 4 times, we want to be looking at things 4 or 5, 6 times. We want to be really, really sure and do really heavy due diligence, because we're going to be relying on a project for several years potentially. If you're only looking at it for maybe 1 year, maybe 2 years, something like that, it might not quite be as much risk or quite as serious. But in my opinion, if I'm looking at a carry forward for potentially 5 years, I'm going to make sure darn well that I'm in the most solid project I could ever be in, the most solid project possible, because I don't want to have any scrutiny on that. The last thing I'd want to do is lose the deduction for that many years in a row, right? So you'd be very, very careful, and even maybe diversifying 2 or 3 projects just to make sure, right? But I'm probably going to be taking the strategy of, the 1 project, maybe 2 that I feel are just totally rock solid, and then just going into those. So that becomes, I think, even more important this year. Let's see. Oh, so based on that, and based on these high quality projects, I want to kind of give you a list of things that I really look for in these projects, and I think that you should as well. But again, it becomes even, the standard of where these things need to be, in my mind, need to be like at this top standard of the industry, especially if I'm looking at a multi-year type deduction that I want. One is that related to the valuation, is the item that's giving valuation to the conservation deduction, what's its intrinsic value, right? Is it a gray area? I do not like projects where we have gray areas. Gray areas mean something for the IRS to scrutinize, right? I like black and white things. So I like oil, I like coal, natural gas, things like that. Things they have an easy to determine value. They're very marketable. For oil, we've already learned in the tax courts that they've ruled that you can always assume that every barrel of oil you can produce will be sold. That's a given, right? So we will never run into a situation where we would get targeted, or that we would get challenged by the IRS saying, well, we see that you have all of these resources here, et cetera, but we don't think you could sell it. We don't think you could monetize it, liquidate it, whatever you want to say. And so we don't believe in the valuation, because the valuation is based on getting actual money in the door. And we've seen some of that with mineral rights, where they might have sandstone, limestone, something like that, where there could be a rock quarry. And yeah, it obviously has value. But the IRS has challenged on a couple occasions that, hey, look, the market for granite, the market for limestone, the market for whatever it might be, it cannot always absorb the entire supply, right? It can go up and down where you can't sell it all, right? I mean, sometimes you can, maybe most times you can, but not always, right? So there's some gray area there. Oil, gas, coal, not like that, okay? You can always sell everything you can produce. I like that, right? So I like to do projects with that item that's the highest and best use, that just is very black and white. Very black and white value. It's very black and white whether it can be sold or not. And, and basically as much oil as you can pump, like for oil as an example, the refiners will buy it. Okay, so no risk there. You definitely want to be looking at experienced project managers. This is not the time to be looking at people who are not very experienced in the industry, not well connected in the industry, people that work with other partners that will take a vested interest in that. For example, we work with a partner who has very good relationships with these landowners and producers of oil. You're talking about a big kind of conglomerate, it's family owned, privately owned. Everybody is on the same team. Everybody's aligned, right? And so there's a lot of experience, there's a lot of knowledge, things are done correctly, and there's proper reserves, et cetera, et cetera. But if there was to be a challenge on anything, you've got several different parties with deep pockets that are going to be on the front lines defending you against anything. So I like that. I like experience. Some people call it old money. I like that term. I want to be dealing with old money, not new money. Okay. Proper reserve. Proper reserve means that's kind of like the OCRUD reserve, right? It's the what happens if, and there's things that can happen. I mean, nothing's out of the realm of possibility. Nothing's ever perfect, right? I mean, it could be that the geologist or something, for some reason in due diligence, they missed that they calculated something wrong or footed something wrong, or for some reason, I don't know, the IRS finds a T not crossed or an I not dotted, something like that. You're going to have to spend money to defend that, and there could be fees to tax attorneys, could be CPAs, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, but there's going to have to be money spent to defend it, to fix it, all that kind of stuff. Stuff happens. It's a what-if scenario, and you don't want to take a risk on that. I mean, because stuff happens. We hope and we know that there's more likely chance than not that everything will be fine. But what if it does? Again, we want to go back to that. We want to be working with partners that are very responsible. They steward money well, they keep things in reserves, and it's rock solid. You wouldn't buy life insurance from a company that didn't have rock solid financials and a lot of cash in their bank, right? Just in case things happen, you want to make sure your loved ones are taken care of, right? You don't want to deal with an insurance company that has financial problems or liquidity problems. The same thing goes here. We want rock solid, strong finances behind every single one of our projects. So it's really important that the project holds reserves for contingencies well above what you could even fathom might be needed, right? So in other words, if you can say, well, it might cost $500,000 at the most to deal with something if everything went wrong. I mean, you want reserves in excess of that, okay? So you want to be super, super careful. You really want to be looking for that. I do think that you really want to be careful that you are, the project you're doing, use your common sense on this, but you want to be careful that the project you're doing is doing something for the environment that is either it's protecting, some form of endangered species or some form of pollution, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, like, I know that there are rules on this, and you can really You don't necessarily have to be meeting these high standards, et cetera, and some of this stuff. But I really like projects personally that really have a very solid, very easy to see purpose where it could be, it's there for an endangered species. In other words, it's going to be able to pull the heartstrings of, of an agent, right? I know that might sound silly, but there is a human aspect to this, and I like the fact of either we are clearly preventing a massive amount of pollution, or there is clearly an animal or a living thing that is benefiting from us conserving this, right? I just like to have that soft side of things. It makes me feel better. And I do think that just from what I've seen, IRS agents are just people, right? And so if you have that good story behind you, I just like that. Again, that's my opinion. You don't necessarily have to have that in these projects, but I just like that, okay? So that's what I'm sharing. Your legal team. You want a strong legal team, okay? You want their documents have been proven, they've been challenged in tax court, and they've held up, okay? And they also is a legal team that has experience, knowledge, depth, and the people on their team that know how to defend conservation, know a lot about this, and have experience with it. Like, it goes a long way when the IRS might challenge something and they can see that, oh, it's it's such and such legal team, right? We've dealt with them before, they're really good. We're probably gonna, they're gonna fight us tooth and nail, they have plenty of money. That stuff plays into it, okay? And, they're all going to the same tax courts a lot of times. Conservation happens a lot in certain areas, and those tax courts are used to hearing these things, right? So these attorneys know how to talk to this particular judge. They know what the issues are, they know the deal, and they kind of go through the motions here. And the judge is very familiar with it, he's familiar with the IRS, what the IRS tries to do, et cetera, et cetera. You want a legal team that can play that game for you, okay? At least, again, these are a little bit of the unwritten rules, but that's my opinion on this. I like to have that. It makes me feel better about these things. Oh, and the last thing I'll say is that it's important, and this kind of goes back to the old money thing or the financial strength of things. It's very important that the item that is making up the value of the conservation donation, right? So if we talk about the highest and best use of the land, which is where you get the deduction from. If the highest and best use is drilling oil, right? If you can show that the highest and best use of this land would be to drill 12 wells, and here's where the wells would be, right? We've already struck oil there, we can already show it's there, et cetera, et cetera. That, we know that it's, we know that the oil can be sold, so we know that, right? So we know the oil's there, we know how much is there, and we know it can be sold, right? You can sell every drop of it. But is the project manager you're working with, are the partners involved? Could they actually drill for oil? Do they know how to do it? I want people that can do it, right? So in other words, if we have a very large piece of land that's being conserved, and for whatever reason, everything goes wrong, goes to hell in a handbasket, and they remove the deduction, I don't know how else better to explain it, but let's just say it just gets completely wiped away, right? And they say no, and we're kind of just sitting there, don't know what to do. I want that partner to be able to save the investors. I want that partner to be able to return capital to the investors and maybe even do better than that, right? So the option has to be, okay, we're not going to be able to do conservation. We're going to unwind this thing. We're going to drill. Really sorry that we're not going to be able to get the donation value that we thought, but that money that you invested, we're going to give you a nice return on it still. We're going to go ahead and drill these 12 wells. You're going to be getting checks for the next 10 years. And hey, maybe it'll take a little longer. Maybe not. Sometimes sometimes it actually ends up working better for you. But that they have the ability to drill and return your capital to you, right? So I like working with groups that are in the business, right? So they're already drilling. They're already in the oil business, let's say. It could be oil, coal, and natural gas. They're already in the business. They just have a piece of land that they could drill on, right? Or that they could mine. They've just chosen not to. All right, and the piece of land next to them, they're drilling on. Okay, so in other words, if this thing doesn't go well, or for some reason, out of anything we could predict, the deal just falls apart and we can't conserve the land, within a week we can have wells there drilling, getting you your capital back. Okay, and I'm talking about myself as an investor here. I'm not trying to sell an investment or anything or give you investment advice. So again, to go through the list again, I want something that has really high intrinsic obvious value. I don't like value that is speculating on what something might sell for. Like, I don't want to have my value as a bunch of condominiums somewhere, and I speculate on what those things are worth. I don't want that. I want just commodities. Okay, commodities with a very readily determinable market price. 2, experienced project managers. I like old money. I like gray hair. 3, the proper reserve. Okay, financial strength. Just like your life insurance company, you want them to have a lot of financial strength, a lot of cash on the balance sheet, right? God forbid you die and your family members don't get what they need because there's no money. You don't want that. I want the same thing with my conservation projects. I like the softer side of stuff that pulls at the heartstrings. That's number 4. Make sure you understand, or make sure you like what this thing is doing. Make sure that a real person, that there's a human element to this, where a real person can understand that you are doing good for the environment and or something good for a living animal. Okay, again, that's not necessarily required, but I like that. I like that human element to it. It makes me feel better about the project. Get a good legal team. That's number 5. Really strong legal team. Knows how to go to tax court and defend all this stuff. More firepower than you would ever need. That's what you want. Has good relationships with the local judges. And I'm not talking about anything squirrely. I'm just saying that there's familiarity there, that it's predictability in what goes on, and that they are seen as competent attorneys by the tax court that they would be in. And that the IRS knows they're competent attorneys, and as soon as they know you have competent attorneys, you become less of a target. That's just common sense. Okay. As soon as they know you don't have competent attorneys, or ones that don't know what they're doing, or just have not done well in court, they're going to push harder. Okay. And then the last one is, make sure that whatever the value's based on, that your partner you're working with can actually do it, just in case everything falls apart. If everything falls apart, make sure that they can sell coal. Make sure that they can extract that natural gas. Make sure that they can drill for that oil, and that they intend to, right? Partners we work with, they intend to, right? If something like that were to happen, it's not a problem. They wouldn't even miss a beat, right? And we get the capital back, and so the investment's not all lost. So if you can't tell, I like risk management. I like hedging. I like being able to cover all my bases, and those are the things that I would be looking for in these projects, especially this year if you're considering trying to do something before the legislation and carrying it forward to future years. All right, that concludes part 2. I've given a lot of information on where this is at. Legislatively, I've given a lot of information on some practical considerations and things to think about, and I've also given some guidelines of what we should really be looking for in high-quality projects. Again, that's my opinion. There's a lot of other items that go into due diligence that we need to look at, but those are kind of the key ones I put together as my sort of half dozen favorites of things that I really look for. Some are a little bit on the softer side, but those are sort of, not everything's always black and white. It can get gray, and I like covering those gray areas too. Okay. So, thank you, and if you have any questions, let us know. Thanks.